Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Kumaradjaja, and I am the great grandson of Marion Wong. And so I would like to share my thoughts as I place myself in relation to my great grandmother, my ancestors, and the more than 5 generations my family has spent in America. As an architectural preservationist, I always imagine myself in periods throughout history, placing myself in historical worlds. And lately, I've been feeling a profound connection to the America of 1916 when my great grandmother was around my age. I cannot imagine how profoundly isolating life was like for Chinese American women during my great grandmother's time. In 1900, there were only a few thousand Chinese American women, and Chinese American men outnumbered them by a factor of 10. Marion and her brother traveled to China to find themselves spouses. She did not find a spouse in China as she was disinterested in any of the men, but she found inspiration. In fact, she ended up meeting someone back at home in America. She married my great grandfather, American born Kim Seung Hong, whose father was a laborer for the Transcontinental Railroad. For Asian Americans, there is this paradox that their country of ancestral origin feels more unfamiliar than America. So the strokes of inspiration must have been so great for Marion as she was exposed in great detail to aspects of her life that were only familial and isolated back at home in America. Her trip to China was inspiring to her, and that was probably the spark of her inspirations. And like many great creative minds, the juices were flowing and experiences were mixing, and what she came up with was amazing. The plot intricately wove American and Chinese traditions and elements. Characters looked dapper in their traditional Eastern and Western garbs, and of course, Marion and Violet were stunning. Their costumes and poise could bring anyone to their knees. There is much to love about the film. But Marion perceived her film to be a failure. Anyone today would see her precocious efforts in founding her own film company, financing, and sourcing materials for the film as incredible. Formally, she only had a third-grade education, but there were so many things that she was self-taught. For Marion to be the first Asian American filmmaker, she must have kept abreast of the newest, latest technology. And for her, at 20 years old, to employ cutting-edge special effects, wow. As Asian Americans are pushed to represent ourselves as occupied with our present. During my great grandmother's present, life was drastically different. No people of color were telling their own stories. Instead, the oppressive establishment gave us exoticizing and disparaging roles to play. The newspaper articles about Marion and her work focused on her slanted eyes, perfect English, but not much about her intricate weaving of two cultures in a film. Her allusions and references come from a complex understanding of the world, but a prejudiced world didn't care. Perhaps in the land of supposedly of the free, the land of supposedly equal opportunity, Marion thought of herself as on equal footing with and afforded the same mobility and opportunity as a white American. However, she never got the traction for the film to take off. She spoke to numerous newspapers trying to sell her film. She engaged the likes of Sid Grauman and others who noticed and appreciated her talent. She even traveled to New York and performed at the Herding and Siemens Theater, which is now the Apollo. But at the time, her groundbreaking intentions and views fell on deaf ears. Marion never spoke of the film again. What did people say to her that made her feel like the Curse of Quan, a failure? After putting the film to rest, Marion, the disillusioned hero, returned to a life of normalcy and humility, back to the everyday jobs after a failed campaign. She raised 5 children. She lost her eldest at 12 years old to spinal meningitis, and she had 4 daughters by 1930. But her husband put tremendous pressure on her to produce a son. By 1935, she had Henry. So this photo is from 1926. My grandmother would be born in 1927. My grandmother always remembered her as a self-made woman, a tender, kind soul who never raised her voice in anger. Even though her film wasn't by any means a financial success, she continued to find ways to make money and survive. The Great Depression was hard on the Hong family. My grandmother had to deliver homemade pies to make ends meet. The only one of her children to follow a life of show business was my grandmother, Arabella Hong Young. She's on the left in this picture, and Marion on the right. My grandmother, who we endearingly call Nana, had a career of her own. Among other things, an opera singer who toured all over Europe, a character on the Richard Rodgers production The Flower Drum Song, which was the first Broadway show with an all-Asian cast, and the shopkeeper on Big Bird in China. Well, in fact, Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote a musical number just for my grandmother's voice. But she had no idea of her own mother's film, not until many years after Marion died. There are photos of Marion witnessing her daughter's illustrious career, one of which was Marion beaming as she watched her own daughter backstage as she was getting ready for her first ever Broadway premiere. And I can't help but imagine the way she was proud of her daughter in ways that she didn't even know about. When her father didn't want her to go to Juilliard, Marion overrode his decision. My grandmother was Marion's success story. As a part of her normal return to normal life, Marion opened a restaurant in Richmond, California called Singapore Hut. After all, Asian Americans were often limited to opening business services at the time. She was a very good cook, and businesses boomed during World War II as it was nearby the shipyards. She was actually so successful that she had many businesses, but throughout her other stints, she had hints of her latent talent and prodigy. She often performed Chinese operas, played her instruments, and had other shows at her restaurant and bar. And later in life, that was what she was known for. Marion was always very creative as a singer, a filmmaker, an artistic producer. She even made floats for the Stockton Parade. So she would work at the restaurant until after the dinner rush. Then her husband would drive her to Oakland, where she'd play mahjong with her friends until 2 a.m. when my grandmother would pick her up. So if you see on the picture on the left, here's my grandmother on the right with her mother in the center and another restaurant worker on the left. And as you can see, she loves playing mahjong. She kept busy, whether it was mahjong or running shifts at her restaurant. And Nana remembers her Chrysler on the driveway, her dogs, and her orchids. She remembers most of all the countless summer days spent at Lake Tahoe with her parents and her siblings. So this prejudice had kiboshed a potential path in Marion's life. And from these pictures, this instead was the trajectory her life took. My mom, too, remembered her tender energy. In her old age, she had lots of grandchildren to visit. So as you can see, this photo is from January 1966. She is on the left carrying my uncle, and my grandmother is in the center with her sister on the right, and my mother is the shy kid who is cowering behind my grandmother. As I wrap with a slide of a couple photos tying the generations together, I think about how far things have come. So here's a photo of my grandmother with Marion in Morningside Heights, just steps away from Columbia University. And here was a selfie on the right of me and my mother and my grandmother taken last month. We must never accept the deprecating, perpetuating oppression that our country has borne upon us. Like her mother, my grandmother found ways to be resilient and resolute in spite of stereotypes. Even one generation later, my grandmother struggled with prejudice. We are Americans first, and never once have we thought of our Asianness first. Why should others? The aspirations of my great-grandmother were starry in 1917, but they were ones that we could all get behind. We just weren't born yet. Today, we are enjoying an unprecedented diversity and representations of Asian Americans. And in this regard, we continue Marion's legacy to strive and to be true to be ourselves. But more than 100 years later, forms of these aspirations are in the process of being achieved. Big screen flicks like Crazy Rich Asians and Shang-Chi and more are understood and appreciated by the community and the larger public, and East meets West on a regular basis. Serials like Warrior buck the stereotypes of Asian men and women while introducing themes of our history for a larger audience, which is now open to learning and appreciative of that insight. We are just now getting the chance to tell our own stories. However, we still have much to work on, but it is a work in progress. When Asians and Asian Americans enter the screen on their own terms, we have no choice but to represent ourselves and to be ourselves. Asian Americans, like many people of color, are stuck in a bit of this bind. By putting ourselves out there, no matter what scene or industry, we are representing Asian America. But every person represents themselves before they represent their race or ethnicity, and Jimmy O. Yang would agree. My great-grandmother is now in good company. If she had somehow known the efforts that are made to represent Asian Americans today and that they are a continuation of hers, perhaps she would have realized how seminal her work was, and perhaps she would have given herself as much credit as we give her long after her passing. Going through Nana's credits, I was shocked to read about and hear demos of her racially typecast roles. She provided voiceovers, sometimes faking Chinese accents, when in reality her accent is purely Californian American. Did you ever get angry about being limited to playing these roles? I asked her recently. Her answer surprised me. No. You should know that you have to say yes to every job. That way you get rid of your competition. Beat them at their own game. But over the years, Nana was searingly aware of the prejudice in the film industry, and she struggled too in her generation. It was only until now that I realized that Nana was channeling her mother with her admirable and enviable resilience. And Nana said to me, "Follow your heart. That's the only thing you can do. Follow your heart. Follow your heart." Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I see from the comment that we have some time to field some questions.
Yeah, we actually have some time, and if an audience have questions, they may ask.
And in that case, with the time that we have left, I can answer some of the questions in the chat. So my mom asked me, how does learning about your family history make me see my own life? Well, it helps you get connected with your past. And it's not just the connecting in in who you are and what you are. We are always finding ways to answer that existential question, what are we? And in a predominantly white country, in a white society, it's very hard for us to see ourselves as American. And by looking at that family history, and this is a question that we've been asking throughout the generations. My grandmother has asked herself that question. My mother has asked herself that question. We have answers that give us ourselves some closure. And seeing that family history allows us to be proud of our heritage in ways that we wouldn't see or we wouldn't be able to see from the outside world. It comes from within, and a family history is one of the best ways to see that coming from within. And so I think not just myself, but myself included, but my mother and the rest of my family have really, really come to see that we can be proud of our history based on the stories that are being told through them.
We have another question in the chat. Yan Fei Song asked, thank you for your informative presentation. And she asked, did Marion mention the trip to China before her marriage?
Hi, Yanfa. I recognize your name. Thank you so much for the research that you've done on my great grandmother. This is truly an honor. And to answer your question, did Marion mention the trip to China before her marriage? I am not sure. The thing is that I know of family members who are aware of her trip to China, and especially her family members who are maybe one generation apart from her are aware of those trips. Um, I do find it kind of interesting that they didn't know about the film, which had been inspired by that trip. Um, that they did not know about that until after she passed away. The exact timing in which my family members were aware of her trip to China, I am not quite sure at this moment, but we have some oral histories that we may find out the answer to, and I could get back to you on that. How and where can we, Shuli Wong asked us, how and where can we watch Marion's film today? It is actually on YouTube, and it's also part of the Library of Congress. All you have to do is Google Gakursa Kwan Guan, and if you can't access YouTube, I'm sure that you can find a way through the Library of Congress to take a look at that at the film.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. We're running out of time, but
Thank you for having me.
thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our next one is our third show and tell, which will be presented by Professor Christopher Rea. He's a professor of Chinese and associate head external, UBC Department of Asian Studies, author of Chinese film classics, 1922 to 1949. creator of the Chinese Film Classics Project, the largest free collection of early Chinese film with English subtitles. So, Professor Ray, we're ready whenever you are.
Thanks very much, Yulong. Thank you for hosting this event. It's been fantastic, and I'm delighted to be speaking after Chris, since he has the closest touch with the archive that any of us could hope to have. And I've been doing a lot of work recently on archival related matters. And so I'm very excited to have a few minutes to share some of what I've been doing with you. And this is really meant to, it's very much in the show and tell spirit. And it is one that is going to close with a call to action of to please participate in building this free online repository of early Chinese films, including the component and the aspects that are articulated to the interests of people interested in the contributions of women to early Chinese cinema, particularly silent cinema. So I want to do a few things. One is that I want to convince you that this repository that I've built is one that contains a few surprises. So I expect that many people participating in this gathering are experts in women in Chinese, on the Chinese silent screen, much more so than I am. But for example, if you look at a famous film like Goddess, right? This is actually one of the most popular films on the YouTube channel that I host and the Chinese Film Classics website. It's a very well-known film, very well studied. And the woman in that film who I think attracts the most attention is the actress Ranling Yu, right, and her nameless character. But there's actually another woman kind of behind the scenes within this film. That is Greta Garbo, who appears, not her face, but just her name appears as Garbo brand cigarettes in one scene of the mise en scène where Ranling Yu's character is walking across the screen. In the back, we see an advertisement, right, in Chinese characters for Garbo, or actually Garbor brand cigarettes. They put an R at the end. And I was browsing on the Kongfuzi Jiushu Wang, right, this old used book repository, and indeed there was such a product back in the 1930s, and so you can buy the tins of Garbo brand cigarettes. So this is to say that this project that I've been working on has been very much about film texts and making them accessible to the English-speaking public and to other publics as well, but it's also one that I think spills offline as well and can lead to other discoveries. So I want to very briefly introduce what I'm calling the Chinese Film Classics Project, which is very much aimed towards the needs of educators and researchers, and pretty much anybody curious about Chinese film history. And I've built a resource with really two main components. One is a website, ChineseFilmClassics.org, that is, I think the really centerpiece is full films with English subtitles. And then there's also an online course that I've developed, much of it shot in my Vancouver office here. And then there are also some other learning resources which I'm kind of adding on an occasional basis. So this has been partly a professional project, partly a nights and weekends thing. I had created this YouTube channel just for kind of like a dumping ground for recorded lectures from YOR, but then I repurposed it at the beginning of the pandemic to really be focused on film, early Chinese film, so Republican era film in particular. And so all of the films that are on the website, I've also put on this YouTube channel. They're primarily hosted there. And then I've also gone one step further in dividing up these films using editing software into particular clips that can be used to highlight what I consider to be significant or at least intriguing elements of different films. And one of my hopes is that this makes these films more modular so that people can have more discoveries. And given that a lot of these films are really obscure to the general public, how are you going to persuade someone to sit down and watch a 90-minute black and white silent film? Well, maybe they'll watch a 3-minute clip first and then decide if they're interested. But most of the time I want to spend on sharing some highlights specifically related to women on the Chinese silver screen. So this is really a resource for people interested in film history. Right now we've got 29 subtitled films and a few more in production. So a lot of these are the kind of greatest hits, right? Famous films like Labor's Love, thought for a long time thought to be the first, but you know, what is the first? I think Marion Wong's film definitely raises some good questions there. And then I'd say about maybe a third to half of the films are silent or are sound on disc. So getting up to that 1934, 1935 kind of transition moment, and then plenty of sound films as well. And on the website, you will find one individual page per film, which will have both the film, kind of a description. I've written down a cast and crew, a synopsis of the plot, and then also some links, right? They're tags to other films. So if you're watching a Chen Yan film, well, Chen Yan was in many films, including a few translated for this project. And so you can find them through these different pages. And in addition to that, partly for my own teaching needs at the University of British Columbia, I created an online course where I do 2 short video lectures of like about 10 to 15 minutes, 2 video lectures per film, where I talk about kind of the results of some of my research into these films. And I just chose 11 films, right, going from Labor's Love up to Crows and Sparrows, but a few of them are silent films. Most of them have female protagonists. And I'm just going to swap over to share. If you go to take a look at, for example, let's say the module on Goddess, right? So you have the film, you have a description of a lot of the information of the film, you have the 2 video lectures, right, with their contents shared there, so you can watch them or your students can watch them. It describes the contents, and then there's also learn more, so you can get different clips from the film. So the concisest establishment of a nightly routine in early Chinese cinema, as far as I'm concerned, is how Wu Yonggang shot this scene of this nameless woman's kind of nightly routine in Shanghai. That's right. It's a model of concision. So you can learn a lot about the cinematic arts through watching that scene. How to identify symbolism in set design. So this is that scene that I just mentioned with the Garbo cigarettes. And those of you who can read Chinese can see that peeking out of the background, the jiabao pai. And then, giving credit to other people in the film, Lim Cho Cho's son, Li Kang, she is actually from Vancouver. But then there are other playlists that integrate with this. So even in silent films, we have songs being represented, even though we can't hear them, but we can see them and read them and the like. And so you can and then you can find related posts about, Ranling Yu and books on Ranling Yu, New Women, Peach Girl, Love and Duty, so on and so forth. So this, I think, is one way of trying to make this archive accessible and a bit more modular than you would usually get if you just had a library to work with. So I've been trying to take advantage of some social media platforms. I'm not a big social media buff, but I have spent some time specifically on YouTube and trying to make things findable and accessible, including through playlists. So all of the films are found on the Chinese Film Classics playlist. There's the course playlist, but then I created a few other thematic playlists focused on what I consider to be superlative scenes that showcase particular aspects of film form or particular thematic elements that might be of interest. There's sounds and songs. So there's a lot of songs that are very important, of course, in sound cinema, but actually also in silent cinema. So you can find quite a few silent films that have songs, usually sung by women. And then how-to. So if you can learn a lot of things from Chinese cinema about how to discover if your spouse is cheating on you, stuff like that. Gags and special effects. So this is really what I consider to be like playlist pedagogy, but it can be self-pedagogy, right? I've curated a few things, but people can, again, click through and find their interests, even if they've never heard of the film itself. And so this is something that I really recommend that students use, especially, or anybody who's kind of new to exploring this archive, to just go in and click around and see what's there and see what interests you. And I want to mention up front, I take requests. This is very much a collaborative project, but one that's, allows for a lot of flexibility and responsiveness. So it's somewhat improvisatory as well. And so I have sections of the website about for educators, how you can use these materials in courses, and why and how this content can be made modular and just used for particular lessons. You can pick and choose what you're working on, the different themes and topics that I detect in these early films. And then I mentioned playlist pedagogy. There's obviously, you can use this to teach Chinese language, reading, writing, listening, and so on, as well as translation. So I'm always looking for more translators. I've been privileged and pleased to work with people from high school students, precocious high school students who want to try their hand at translating films, all the way up to PhD students, at Oxbridge, and professors like myself who are interested in this and want to help build this resource. So I think that this is a wonderful way of doing close reading on film and having to figure out not just how do you translate the words, but how do you make them fit within that frame as well. So this is, I think, definitely a labor of love in a lot of ways. Okay, so now let's move on to talk about women specifically on the Chinese silent screen. So here are a few highlights from the archive that I would want to point out. And then I hope you will raise comments and questions so we can have a little discussion here. So I've done some collaboration with film archives. So I think in this gathering, you're going to be watching or have watched Love and Duty, right? A restored copy, which is a fantastic restoration job. And I was privileged to spend about a year or so working with the curators and staff at the Taipei Taiwan Film and Audiovisual Institute. And they eventually gave permission for me to publish on YouTube for free this unrestored copy of the film. And so I recommend that if you're interested in film restoration, or interested in just running Yu Jinyan's and Richard Poe's work, that you check out this copy as well and compare. But if you're interested in particular stars, so I've started with kind of trying to create special features on some of the leading ladies of the silent screen. So Chen Yanyan is a very important one from the UPS or Lianhua studio. And I mentioned, this up in the top right there, this is the resources on early Chinese cinema, where you'd find that. Li as well, right? Definitely a standout, someone whose career, like Chen Yanyan's, went from the silent era to the sound era. The magnetic presence of Ranling Yu doesn't need much introduction. But then there are other things as well. So you can see even in films like this sound film, right? The earliest extant Mulan film that we have, made during the anti-Japanese war, with Nancy Chan up from Hong Kong in the title role. That this is a fantastic film that still stars a lot of people from the silent era who had just made that transition into sound cinema. And I think there's a lot in these later films even where you can see traces, especially in Yuan Muzhi's films from the late 30s, these traces of the silent cinema aesthetic coming through here, especially in the representation of women. So there are quite a few. There are quite a few women, and I just wanted to list a few of the names here so that you have them. Everyone from the tragic Aixia, who appears in Spring Silkworms, right, adapted from the Mao Dun story, to some of the early woman warriors who appear on screen, right, Bai Hong, their Fan Xuepeng or Ban Shibong, and the like. So this is obviously related a bit to the book that I wrote on Chinese film classics from 1922 to 1949. And I spent some time trying to dig out what were the original English names that these people were known by and how were they credited on screen. So even someone like Chen Yanyan, they rendered her name like 4 or 5 different ways in different films. So if you're doing research into this era, it's really helpful to know all of the different names that people were known by. So Juanita Wong, right, that most people have heard of Wang Renmei, but maybe not Juanita Wong. So these are some of the women who appear in silent films. There are many more in sound films, of course. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what you can find within the playlists here. So most raucous scene in a silent film. I chose that one from Great Road. That's a wonderful tea house restaurant scene. Best conversation about love in a silent film, I'd again say Great Road. Most risque joke in the first scene of a film, to me, is one from Laborer's Love. But for the poshest love nest and the most dramatic heroine entrance are from You Can Go Explore on Your Own. And this is, again, an archive in development, very much so. So one example that I would give on the top right here, best trick staircase since Laborer's Love. Right, one of the most eye-catching things in that early silent film, Laborer's Love, is the trick staircase. Well, it turns out just a few years later in Woman Warrior White Rose, we have another trick staircase. And the person who's on the staircase this time is the woman warrior herself, fighting off these thugs.
Sorry,
So
2 minutes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. I'm just about to wrap up. So some of the coming attractions, just to mention what's in the pipeline, is these are some of the silent films that I'm working on now with a few different collaborators. Some are relatively well-known films like A String of Pearls, Cave of the Silken Web, right? Some partially extant films here as well. And some that are not as well known, like 火山清雪, the Volcanic Passions, an early Sun Yu film. Some of these actually are available at the Columbia University archives. You can download them for free. Some of the digitized VHS. So all of the films in this YouTube and website archive are best available quality. Many of them are very imperfect, but I figure we'll work with what we have for now. And then collectively, I hope we can all create a better archive in the future. So if you're curious to learn more about this project, I wrote a couple things about it. One specifically for educators in Education About Asia, that AAS periodical. And then another for the journal Global Storytelling. These are both open access, so you can find them on their websites there about the love and duty involved in doing this type of work. So do check out the website, do check out the Modern Chinese Cultural Studies YouTube channel if you have a chance. And then my call to action is to join this project. Again, we've had some very distinguished scholars, graduate students, undergraduate students, high school students, IT people working on this project. So it's been a lot of work, but a lot of fun as well. And again, we take requests. So please do write to me if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rea, for sharing this great resource with us. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. If audience have questions, you may put in the chat and you can answer there. Thank you. So next we will have a screening of a documentary film called Daughter of Shanghai, which is by director Michelle Miao Chen. And this film is about female actress Zhou Caiqing. And I hope everyone enjoyed the film. We are delighted to have invited director Michelle Chen Miao to join us for an interview, and with special thanks to Beijing Contemporary Art Foundation to make this happen. Director Michelle Chen Miao is a well-known film director from China New Cinema, a graduate of Beijing Film Academy. She went to study in US and work in Fox Worldwide before returning to China to apply her Western experience to filmmaking. Her feature film Song of the Stars won the Best Upcoming Directors Award at China American Film Festival, won the Best Humanity Award at Beijing Youth Film Festival, won the Best Youth Writer Director Award, etc. Her first feature film, Mini, was theatrically released nationwide in Greater China. A Girl 13 was entered into the 6th Cannes Film Festival for the junior competition and won Best Digital Film at Beijing Youth Film Festival. She is a seasoned documentary filmmaker. Her recent documentary, Daughter of Shanghai, was theatrically released in mainland China. The Snake Boy, Shanghai Dreams, and Lulu and Me have been critically acclaimed at various international film festivals and have been broadcasted by TV channels throughout China and Asia. Michelle Miao Chen is the founder of Temperature Movie, a multiple media platform providing digital contents for internet, WeChat, and digital TV. And the interview will be conducted by Xiaoyang again, and will be in Chinese. So